All right. This is the first short video for Wednesday, September 30th. We're going to be looking at the rise of church music, but we've got to do some backfilling first. Um, you guys, I believe, are all in what we call evangelical churches. Evangelical churches are not the majority in Christianity. They are a minority. And evangelical worship is not the majority, it is a minority. And we tend to think that since we grow up in a certain church or certain style, that this is the style that's everywhere, and that's not. For instance, I was at Hillspring Church for 18 years. I was a member of the Board of Elders and did a lot of work there. And we followed what's called the church calendar or the liturgical calendar, and which has specific seasons throughout the year, seasons of celebration, seasons of contemplation, such as Advent, which will be coming up here fairly soon. Advent is the time leading up to the birth of Christ. In generally later on in February, March, we go into March usually. We go into what is called Lent. Lent is the 40 days prior to Easter. So if you're interested, just Google liturgical calendar and it'll pop up. I think you'll be kind of surprised at how other churches do this. But we also need to understand where our current church music came from. And so I have posted a paper on the discussion board, and it's open today on the 30th. And it's called, The Reformation, the Pipe Organ, the Rise of Church Music. Basically, music evolved from the Jewish synagogues into chant, plain song. By the 8th, 9th century, chant was very, very common. It was the predominant thing. But then we began to see what's called polyphony. Polyphony. It's a nice big word. It simply means there were two or three or more tones for each melodic line. In other words, harmony, we would call it. And by the 10th century, 11th, 12th century, polyphonic style was very, very popular throughout Europe. And it culminated in some of the spectacular organ works from the School of Composers at Notre Dame in Paris. And the pipe organ is one of the least understood instruments among evangelicals that you're ever going to find. Pipe organ is the single most powerful musical instrument ever devised by anybody. The original pipe organs, though, were pretty weak, but they were different, and they sounded different, and they could make more than one sound. They could play, sound like different reed instruments. They could sound like other instruments. And it was basically the thing of a pipe organ is that it has at least one keyboard, but now modern ones have up to 5 keyboards stacked on each other, and probably 100 different buttons to press and levers to pull, and then a full set of foot pedals mimicking the piano. So the organist had to be kind of an octopus, kind of a very coordinated octopus, because he's playing with both hands, quite often on 2 different keyboards, and both feet are playing on the pedals. And the pedals produce the bass notes. The way it worked is by forcing air through these tubes and pressing a key. It allowed the air to go through a specific tube. Just like on the harpsichord or the piano, you hit a specific key, that's the note you get. The air was compressed by young boys with bellows, if you've ever seen bellows, pumping air into it as fast and furiously as they could. Well, over time, as the organ makers got more inventive, they created bigger and bigger organs, which needed more and more boys to be pumping the bellows all the time until it got a little bit ridiculous. But even then, they invented different ways of doing this. But the pipe organ by itself became the single most noticeable instrument in the church. Now, they had trumpets, they had trombones, they weren't the modern versions. And so they had this kind of music. But the organ, as it developed, became something much more than any of these things ever had been. Prior to the organ, most church singing was a cappella, meaning just by voice, no instruments. We'll be looking at some a cappella songs later, and we already looked at some earlier, I believe. But one of the things about a cappella is it's only so as powerful as the voices of the singers. Now today, of course, we have amplification. But the organs of that day began to accompany the a cappella choirs, and they were no longer a cappella. And the result was a more powerful sense of music, a more powerful sense of worship. So what they did is they started with chant and started harmonizing it. And then the organist started improvising, creating new melodies, creating new harmonies. And after a while, composers started writing for the organ. So by the time of what we call the Renaissance, or the Reformation, you see, you get this old, this is what happens. By the time of the Reformation, the pipe organ had been pretty well developed. They had giant bellows in the back where several boys would be working the bellows to make enough air go through the pipe organ. And modern pipe organs are absolutely astonishing. The Wanamaker organ in New York City has 25,000 different pipes, and each pipe makes a different sound. Well, here's what happened. 502 years ago, a man named Martin Luther, he was a monk, he was a professor of Hebrew in Wittenberg, Germany. And he got into an argument with a priest named Johannes Tetzel over what were called indulgences. Indulgences were basically a piece of paper that you paid money for, and it said it was kind of a get-out-of-hell-free card or a get-out-of-purgatory free card. Well, Luther says there is no scriptural basis for this at all. And so he got into these arguments with Tetzel, and he finally wrote down 95 theses. Now, you remember theses from college writing? They're argument points. He wrote 95 of them, and he nailed them to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. This is not the first time that this happened, but something else had happened in the meantime, and it changed everything. All Luther wanted was a debate. But you see, the printing press had been developed. And so copies of his 95 Theses were printed over and over and over again and distributed among the towns throughout Germany. And as people began to read them, they began to challenge the Roman Catholic Church and the clergy. Well, Tetzel was furious, and he went back to Rome, and long story short, Luther was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Now, what that meant in those days was he was found guilty of heresy because his writings challenged the Pope, said the Pope doesn't have the authority to do this. This isn't scriptural. Where do you guys get the idea that you can do this? Only God can forgive sins. It meant death as a heretic. But what happened was the people rose up against the Catholic Church all across Germany, and they began to take up arms against each other, Catholics and these followers of Luther, who called themselves Lutherans. Imagine that. It turned into wars, and Luther had to take cover in a castle. And there was a duke that was sympathetic to him and said, "I will protect you." Well, while he was there, he wrote several bits of poetry. But one of the most famous, and it changed all of Protestant direction, was called Eine kleine Festeburg ist Gott, which means a mighty fortress is our God. And it became the hymn of the Reformation. It swept Europe. And he wrote the music to it as well. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work his woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate, on earth is not his equal. Ein Festeburg was written by Luther, and it was taken by the organist of the cathedral in that town, who began to play it, who began to improvise on it, who began to flesh it out, turned it into four-part harmony, and it became the single most prominent song in Christian history. It is still there. The words are a paraphrase of Psalm 46. So eventually it made its way all the way here to what's now the United States. And so along with the printing press, the pipe organ, and Luther's music and the words, which they began to form huge choirs, changed the course of history. It changed music forever. Modern pipe organs can produce the sound of a full orchestra. They can sing, they can cry, they can make any sound imaginable. Here we're going to go through, when you download the paper, there are several hyperlinks to various bits of organ music and music from that time. And I encourage you, as you read the paper, as you go through it, to hit those hyperlinks. Okay, this ends part 1.